Bob, what happens if I'm in a real estate transaction and the seller decides not to sell?
Well, Jason, that's a problem. The whole idea of a real estate transaction is to enter into a contract. Contract is a promise by the seller to sell for a certain price and the buyer to buy for a certain price. The buyer then goes out, tries to get a mortgage, hopefully does get one, and wants to proceed to closing. He is anticipating being able to buy the seller's property for whatever the agreed upon price is, and hoping that the seller will move out on time and allow him to move out of wherever he is and move in to his new location. The seller is under an obligation to sell his property. There is an action called an action for specific performance, wherein a buyer would go to court and ask a judge, Judge, I am in contract to buy a certain property, but the seller doesn't want to sell to me. Please make him specifically perform. And if they are in contract, and barring any sort of title issues that would prevent the seller from selling, the seller would lose that lawsuit and be bound to sell his property. Now that's the legal part of it. The practical part of it is that the buyer would have to go out and retain an attorney, probably spend some money on a retainer, go to court. Court could be both expensive and a timely process. So the buyer could win the lawsuit, but really at what expense? Also, practically speaking, from the seller's point of view, generally in this market, sellers are not selling, refusing to sell, because they have a higher offer. Years ago, when the market was very hot, they might be in contract and receive a better offer from somebody else and feel it was advantageous for them to go with somebody else and try to break the contract. The market isn't that way today. However, generally what I'm finding when sellers decide not to sell is because something in their next chain of events has changed. For instance, with the storm Sandy, many sellers were anticipating going to another location. That location may have been damaged or destroyed by Sandy. So essentially the seller was in a position whereby they could not leave their premises, so they would want to break the contract. The seller doesn't have much to risk in trying to break the contract, so they may decide to roll the dice, in other words, and try and force the buyer just to give in. If the seller was successful in this strategy, he would have to return both the down payment and also whatever expenses the buyer incurred in the title charges. So basically, Jason, that is what would happen if the seller decided not to sell.